Hey friends, tonight I'm going to be reading from a book called Lincoln the Unknown by Dale Carnegie. This is a book that comes to me in my childhood from my uncle, who was himself a high school teacher and an avid reader. He had a huge library in his basement, and he gave me a copy of this book when I was in college, and he said, "I think you'd really like this book," and I did. In fact, I was a little hesitant to read it because I had already read a book by Dale Carnegie as a freshman in college called How to Win Friends and Influence People for an interpersonal communications class that I took my first year. And when I was asked by the professor what I thought of How to Win Friends and Influence People, I told him somewhat cavalierly that I thought it was mistitled, that it should have been called How to Manipulate People by Pretending to be Someone You're Not, and that I didn't think very highly of it. Now, that was probably a rather unfair assessment of the book, but I don't know because I've never returned to it. I really disliked it. And so when I picked this up, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I respected my uncle, and he spoke so highly of this book that I thought, well, we'll give it a try. And I liked it so much that even though I've thought, someday I'm going to return to How to Win Friends and Influence People, whenever I think of Dale Carnegie, I think I'd just rather read this book again. So I've done that several times. I've never returned to How to Win Friends and Influence People. Maybe I'd be better off knowing how to win friends and influence people instead of maybe my life looking more like Dale Carnegie's. Maybe it's looked more like Abraham Lincoln's, which is not a compliment towards myself if you read this book. I just mean because of the sorrow that Abraham Lincoln went through. If he'd had more friends, maybe he would have been a little bit happier. But this book was published in 1932, 4 years before How to Win Friends and Influence People came out. And it's not actually a very long book. It's not a scholarly book. It's more the inner life of Abraham Lincoln as told from Dale Carnegie's perspective after doing a lot of research on it. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to read the introduction, which I think will give you a little bit of insight into why I think the book is worth reading and why I've enjoyed it so much. I'm also turning it sideways so you can see it's not a long book. It's a very quick read, I think, very interesting read. So I'm going to read the introduction, and then I'm going to read chapters 4 and 5, not to give you any spoilers, but also not to dive into the background too much of Lincoln's parents, etc. So the introduction is actually called How This Book Was Written and Why. One spring day some years ago, I was breakfasting in the Hotel Dysart, London, and as usual, I was trying to winnow a bit of American news from the columns of the Morning Post. Ordinarily, I found none, but on that fortunate morning, I made a strike rich and unexpected. The late T.P. O'Connor, reputed father of the House of Commons, conducted in those days a column in the Morning Post entitled Men and Memories. On that particular morning, and for several mornings following, Tepe's column was devoted to Abraham Lincoln, not to his political activities, but to the personal side of his career, to his sorrows, his repeated failures, his poverty, his great love for Anne Rutledge, and his tragic marriage to Mary Todd. I read the series with profound interest and surprise. I had spent the first 20 years of my life in the Middle West, not far from the Lincoln country, and in addition to that, I had always been keenly interested in United States history. I should have said that, of course, I knew Lincoln's life story, but I soon discovered that I didn't. The fact is that I, an American, had had to come to London and read a series of articles written by an Irishman in an English newspaper before I realized that the story of Lincoln's career was one of the most fascinating tales in all the annals of mankind. Was this lamentable ignorance peculiar to me, I wondered. But I didn't wonder long, for I soon discussed the subject with a number of my fellow countrymen, and I discovered that they were in the same boat, that about all they knew about Lincoln was this: that he had been born in a log cabin, had walked miles to borrow books and then read them at night, stretched out on the floor in front of the fireplace, that he split rails, became a lawyer, told funny stories, said that a man's legs ought to be long enough to reach the ground, was called Honest Abe, debated with Judge Douglas, was elected President of the United States, wore a silk hat, freed the slaves, spoke at Gettysburg, declared that he wished he knew what brand of whiskey Grant drank so he could send a barrel of it to his other generals, and was shot by Booth in a theater in Washington. Aroused by these articles in the Morning Post, I went over to the British Museum Library and read a number of Lincoln books. And the more I read, the more fascinated I became. Finally, I caught on fire, and I determined to write a book about Lincoln myself. I knew that I had not the urge, temperament, training, or ability necessary to produce a learned treatise for the benefit of scholars and historians. Besides, I felt there was little need for another book of that kind, for many excellent ones are already in existence. However, after reading many Lincoln volumes, I did feel that there was a genuine need for a short biography that would tell the most interesting facts about his career briefly and tersely for the average busy and hurried citizen of today. I have tried to write such a book. I began the work in Europe and labored over it for a year there and then for 2 years in New York. Finally, I tore up all that I had written and tossed it into the wastebasket. I then went out to Illinois to write of Lincoln on the very ground where he himself had dreamed and toiled. For months I lived among people whose fathers had helped Lincoln survey land and build fences and drive hogs to market. For months I delved among old books and letters and speeches and half-forgotten newspapers and musty court records, trying to understand Lincoln. I spent one summer in the little town of Petersburg. I went there because it is only a mile away from the restored village of New Salem, where Lincoln spent the happiest and most formative years of his life. There he ran a mill and a grocery store, studied law, worked as a blacksmith, refereed cockfights and horse races, fell in love, and had his heart broken. Even in the heyday of its glory, New Salem never had more than 100 inhabitants, and its entire existence covered a span of about 10 years. Shortly after Lincoln left the village, it was abandoned. Bats and swallows nested in the decaying cabins, and for more than half a century cows grazed over the spot. A few years ago, however, the state of Illinois secured the site, made it a public park, and built replicas of the log cabins that had stood there 100 years before. So today, the deserted village of New Salem looks much as it did in Lincoln's time. The same white oaks under which Lincoln studied and wrestled and made love are still standing. Every morning I used to take my typewriter and motor up there from Petersburg, and half of the chapters of this book were written under those trees. What a lovely spot in which to work! In front of me flowed the winding Sangamon, and all about me the woods and the hayfields were musical with the call of the bobwhite, and through the trees flashed the color of the blue jay, the yellowhammer, and the redbird. I felt Lincoln there. I often used to go there alone on summer nights when the whippoorwills were crying in the woods along the banks of the Sangamon, when the moonlight outlined Rutledge's tavern against the sky, and it stirred me to realize that on just such nights, about 100 years ago, young Abraham Lincoln and Anne Rutledge had walked over this same ground, arm in arm in the moonlight, listening to the night birds and dreaming ecstatic dreams that were destined never to come true. Yet I am convinced that Lincoln found here at New Salem the only supreme happiness that he ever knew. When I came to write the chapter dealing with the death of Lincoln's sweetheart, I put a little folding table and a typewriter in a car and drove out over country roads and through a hog lot and a cow pasture until I reached the quiet, secluded spot where Anne Rutledge lies buried. It is utterly abandoned now and overgrown. To get near her grave, it is necessary to mow down the weeds and brush and vines. And there, where Lincoln came to weep, was set down the story of his grief. Many of the chapters were written in Springfield, some in the sitting room of the old home where Lincoln lived for 16 unhappy years, some at the desk where he composed his first inaugural address, and others above the spot where he came to court and quarrel with Mary Todd. Chapter 4. The Lincolns settled near Decatur, Illinois, on a stretch of timberland running along a bluff overlooking the Sangamon River. Abe helped to fell trees, erect a cabin, cut brush, clear the land, break 15 acres of sod with a yoke of oxen, plant it to corn, split rails, and fence the property in. The next year he worked as a hired man in the neighborhood, doing odd jobs for farmers, plowing, pitching hay, mauling rails, butchering hogs. The first winter Abe Lincoln spent in Illinois was one of the coldest the state had known. Snow drifted 15 feet deep on the prairies. Cattle died, the deer and wild turkey were almost exterminated, and even people were frozen to death. During the winter, Lincoln agreed to split 1,000 rails for a pair of trousers made from brown jean cloth dyed with white walnut bark. He had to travel 3 miles each day to work. Once, while crossing the Sangamon, his canoe was upset. He was thrown into the icy water, and before he could reach the nearest house, Major Warnick's, his feet froze. For a month he was unable to walk, and he spent that time lying in front of the fireplace at Major Warnick's telling stories and reading a volume of the statutes of Illinois. Prior to this, Lincoln had courted the Major's daughter, but the Major frowned on the idea. What? A daughter of his? A Warnick, married to this gawky, uneducated rail-splitter? A man without land, without cash, and without prospects? Never. True, Lincoln didn't own any land, and that wasn't all. He didn't want to own any. He had spent 22 years on farms, and he had had enough of pioneer farming. He hated the grinding toil, the lonely monotony of the life, longing for distinction as well as for contact with other social beings. He wanted a job where he could meet people and gather a crowd around him and keep them roaring at his stories. While living back in Indiana, Abe had once helped float a flatboat down the river to New Orleans. And what fun he'd had. Novelty, excitement, adventure. One night, while the boat was tied up to the shore at the plantation of Madame Duquesne, a gang of Negroes armed with knives and clubs climbed aboard. They meant to kill the crew, throw their bodies into the river, and float the cargo down to the thieves' headquarters at New Orleans. Lincoln seized the club and with his long, powerful arms knocked 3 of the marauders into the river, then chased the others ashore. But in the fight, one of them slashed Lincoln's forehead with a knife and left over his right eye a scar that he carried to his grave. No, Tom Lincoln could not hold the boy Abe to a pioneer farm. Having seen New Orleans once, Abe now got himself another river job. For 50 cents a day and a bonus, he and his stepbrother and second cousin cut down trees, hewed logs, floated them to a sawmill, built a flatboat 80 feet long, loaded it with bacon, corn, and hogs, and floated it down the Mississippi. Lincoln did the cooking for the crew, steered the boat, told stories, played 7-Up, and sang in a loud voice. I don't know the tune, so I'm going to read it. The turbaned Turk that scorns the world, and struts about with his whiskers curled, for no other man but himself to see. This trip down the river made a profound and lasting impression upon Lincoln. Herndon says, in New Orleans, for the first time, Lincoln beheld the true horrors of human slavery. He saw, quote, Negroes in chains, whipped and scourged, unquote. Against this inhumanity, his sense of right and justice rebelled, and his mind and conscience were awakened to a realization of what he had often heard and read. No doubt, as one of his companions has said, slavery ran the iron into him then and there. One morning in their rambles over the city, the trio passed a slave auction. A vigorous and comely mulatto girl was being sold. She underwent a thorough examination at the hands of the bidders. They pinched her flesh and made her trot up and down the room like a horse to show how she moved, and in order, as the auctioneer said, that bidders might satisfy themselves whether the article they were offering to buy was sound or not. The whole thing was so revolting that Lincoln moved away from the scene with a deep feeling of unconquerable hate. Bidding his companions follow him, he said, By God, boys, let's get away from this. If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard. Lincoln became very popular with Denton Offutt, the man who hired him to go to New Orleans. Offutt liked his jokes and stories and honesty. He employed the young man to go back to Illinois, fell trees, and build a log cabin grocery store in New Salem, a tiny village composed of 15 or 20 cabins perched on a bluff high above the winding Sangamon. Here Lincoln clerked in the store and also ran a grist and sawmill, and here he lived for 6 years, years that had a tremendous influence on his future. The village had a wild, pugnacious, hell-raising gang of ruffians called the Clary's Grove Boys, a crowd who boasted that they could drink more whiskey, swear more profanely, wrestle better, and hit harder than any other group in all Illinois. At heart, they weren't a bad lot. They were loyal, frank, generous, and sympathetic, but they loved to show off. So when the loud-mouthed Denton Offutt came to town and proclaimed the physical prowess of his grocery clerk, Abraham Lincoln, the Clary Grove boys were delighted. They would show this upstart a thing or two. But the showing was all the other way, for this young giant won their foot races and jumping contests, and with his extraordinarily long arms he could throw a maul or toss a cannonball farther than any of them. Besides, he could tell the kind of funny stories they could understand, and he kept them laughing for hours at his backwoods tales. He reached the high water mark of his career in New Salem as far as the Clary's Grove boys were concerned, on the day all the town gathered under the white oak trees to see him wrestle with their leader, Jack Armstrong. When Lincoln laid Armstrong out, he had arrived, he had achieved the ultimate. From that time on, the Clary's Grove boys gave him their friendship and crowned him with their allegiance. They appointed him judge of their horse races and referee of their cockfights. And when Lincoln was out of work and had no home, they took him into their cabins and fed him. Lincoln found here in New Salem an opportunity he had been seeking for years, an opportunity to conquer his fears and learn to speak in public. Back in Indiana, the only chance that he had at this sort of thing had been in talking to little groups of laborers in the fields. But here in New Salem, there was an organized literary society that met every Saturday night in the dining room of the Rutledge Tavern. Lincoln joined it with alacrity and took a leading part on its program, telling stories, reading verses that he had written himself, making extemporaneous talk on such subjects as the navigation of the Sangamon River, and debating the various questions of the day. This activity was priceless. It widened his mental horizon and awakened his ambition. He discovered that he had an unusual ability to influence other men by his speech. That knowledge developed his courage and self-confidence as nothing else had ever done. In a few months, Offutt's store failed, and Lincoln was out of a job. An election was coming on, the state was seething with politics, and so he proposed to cash in on his ability to speak. With the aid of Mentor Graham, the local schoolteacher, he toiled for weeks over his first address to the public, in which he announced that he was a candidate for the state legislature. He stated that he favored, quote, internal improvements, the navigation of the Sangamon, better education, justice, end quote, and so on. In closing, he said, I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relatives or friends to recommend me. And he concluded with this pathetic sentence, but if the people in their wisdom shall see fit to keep me in the background, I have been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined. A few days later, a horseman dashed into New Salem with the startling news that the great Sac Indian chief Black Hawk was on the warpath with his braves, burning homes, capturing women, massacring settlers, and spreading terror along Rock River. In a panic, Governor Reynolds was calling for volunteers, and Lincoln, out of work, penniless, a candidate for office, joined the forces for 30 days, was elected captain, and tried to drill the Clary's Grove boys, who shouted back at his commands, "Go to the devil!" Herndon says Lincoln always regarded his participation in the Black Hawk War as a sort of holiday affair and chicken-stealing expedition. It was just about that. Later, in the course of a speech in Congress, Lincoln declared that he didn't attack any Redskins, but that he made charges upon the wild onions. He said he didn't see any Indians, but that he had had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. Returning from the war, Captain Lincoln plunged again into his political campaign, going from cabin to cabin, shaking hands, telling stories, agreeing with everyone, and making speeches whenever and wherever he could find a crowd. When the election came, he was defeated, although he received all but 3 of the 208 votes cast in New Salem. 2 years later, he ran again, was elected, and had to borrow money to buy a suit of clothes to wear to the legislature. He was reelected in 1836, 1838, and 1840. There was living in New Salem at that time a ne'er-do-well whose wife had to take in boarders while he fished and played the fiddle and recited poetry. Most of the people in town looked down upon Jack Kelso as a failure, but Lincoln liked him, chummed with him, and was greatly influenced by him. Before he met Kelso, Shakespeare and Burns had meant little to Lincoln. They had been merely names, and vague names at that. But now, as he sat listening to Jack Kelso reading Hamlet and reciting Macbeth, Lincoln realized for the first time what symphonies could be played with the English language, what a thing of infinite beauty it could be, what a whirlwind of sense and emotion. Shakespeare awed him, but Bobby Burns was his love and sympathy. Won his love and sympathy. He felt even a kinship with Burns. Burns had been poor like Lincoln. Burns had been born in a cabin no better than the one that had seen Abe's birth. Burns, too, had been a plowboy, but a plowboy to whom the plowing up of the nest of a field mouse was a tiny tragedy, an event worthy of being caught up and immortalized in a poem. Through the poetry of Burns and Shakespeare, a whole new world of meaning and feeling and loveliness opened up to Abraham Lincoln. But to him the most astounding thing of all was this: neither Shakespeare nor Burns had gone to college. Neither of them had had much more schooling and education than he. At times he dared to think that perhaps he too, the unschooled son of illiterate Tom Lincoln, might be fitted for finer things. Perhaps it would not be necessary for him to go on forever selling groceries or working as a blacksmith. From that time on, Burns and Shakespeare were his favorite authors. He read more of Shakespeare than of all other authors put together, and this reading left its imprint upon his style. Even after he reached the White House, when the burdens and worries of the Civil War were chiseling deep furrows in his face, he devoted much time to Shakespeare. Busy as he was, he discussed the plays with Shakespearean authorities, and carried on a correspondence regarding certain passages. The week he was shot, he read Macbeth aloud for 2 hours to a circle of friends. The influence of Jack Kelso, the shiftless New Salem fisherman, had reached to the White House. The founder of New Salem and the keeper of the tavern was a Southerner named James Rutledge, and he had a most attractive daughter, Anne. She was only 19 when Lincoln met her, a beautiful girl with blue eyes and auburn hair. Despite the fact that she was already engaged to the richest merchant in town, Lincoln fell in love with her. Anne had already promised to become the wife of John McNeill, but it was understood that they would not be married until she had 2 years of college. Lincoln had not been in New Salem very long when a strange thing happened. McNeill sold his store and said that he was returning to New York State to bring his mother and father and family back to Illinois. But before leaving town, he confessed something to Anne Rutledge that almost stunned her. However, she was young, and she loved him, and she believed his story. A few days later, he set out from Salem, waving goodbye to Anne and promising to write often. Lincoln was postmaster of the village then. The mail arrived by stagecoach twice a week, and there was very little of it, for it cost from 6.25 cents to 25 to send a letter, depending on the distance it must travel. Lincoln carried the letters about in his hat. When people met him, they would ask if he had any mail for them, and he would pull off his hat and look through his collection to see what he had. Twice each week, Anne Rutledge inquired for a letter. 3 months passed before the first one arrived. McNeill explained that he had not written sooner because he had been taken sick with a fever while crossing Ohio and had been in bed for 3 weeks, part of the time unconscious. 3 more months passed before the next letter came, and when it arrived, it was almost worse than no letter at all. It was cold and vague. He said that his father was very ill, that he was being harassed by his father's creditors, and that he did not know when he would be back. After that, Anne watched the mail for months, hoping for more letters, which never came. Had he ever really loved her at all? She had begun now to doubt it. Lincoln, seeing her distress, volunteered to try to find McNeill. "No," she said, "he knows where I am, and if he doesn't care enough to write to me, I am sure I do not care enough to have you try to find him." Then she told her father of the extraordinary confession that McNeill had made before he left. He had admitted that he had been living under an assumed name for years. His real name was not McNeill, as everyone in New Salem believed, but McNamar. Why had he practiced this deception? His father, he explained, had failed in business back in New York State and had become heavily involved in debts. He, being the eldest son, had, without disclosing his destination, come west to make money. He feared that if he used his right name, his family might learn of his whereabouts and follow him, and he would be obliged to support them all. He didn't want to be hampered by any such burden while struggling to make a start. It might delay his progress for years. So he took an assumed name. But now that he had accumulated property, he was going to bring his parents to Illinois and let them share his prosperity. When the story got abroad in the village, it created a sensation. People called it a lie and branded him as an impostor. The situation looked bad, and gossip made the worst of it. He was, well, there was no telling what he was. Perhaps he was already married. Maybe he was hiding from 2 or 3 wives. Who knew? Maybe he had robbed a bank. Maybe he had murdered somebody. Maybe he was this. Maybe he was that. He had deserted Anne Rutledge, and she ought to thank God for it. Such was New Salem's verdict. Lincoln said nothing, but he thought much. At last the chance for which he had hoped and prayed had come. One more chapter, chapter 5. The Rutledge Tavern was a rough, weather-beaten affair, with nothing whatever to distinguish it from 1,000 other log cabins along the frontier. A stranger would not have given it a second glance, but Lincoln could not keep his eyes off it now, nor his heart out of it. To him it filled the earth and towered to the sky, and he never crossed the threshold of it without a quickening of his heart. Borrowing a copy of Shakespeare's plays from Jack Kelso, he stretched himself out on top of the store counter, and turning over the pages, he read these lines again and again. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. He closed the book. He could not read. He could not think. He lay there for an hour, dreaming, living over in memory all the lovely things Anne had said the night before. He lived now for only one thing, for the hours that he spent with her. Quilting parties were popular in those days, and Anne was invariably invited to these affairs, where her slender fingers plied the needle with unusual swiftness and art. Lincoln used to ride with her in the morning to the place where the quilting was to be held, and call for her again in the evening. Once he boldly went into the house, a place where men seldom ventured on such occasions, and sat down beside her. Her heart throbbed, and a flood of color rose to her face. In her excitement, she made irregular and uncertain stitches, and the older and more composed women noticed it. They smiled. The owner kept this quilt for years, and after Lincoln became president, she proudly displayed it to visitors and pointed out the irregular stitches made by his sweetheart. On summer evenings, Lincoln and Anne strolled together along the banks of the Sangamon, where whippoorwills called in the trees and fireflies wove golden threads through the night. In the autumn, they drifted through the woods, when the oaks were flaming with color and hickory nuts were pattering to the ground. In the winter, after the snow had fallen, they walked through the forest, when every oak and ash and walnut wore ermine too dear for an earl, and the poorest twig on the elm tree was ridged inch-deep with pearl. For both of them now, life had taken on a sacred tenderness, a new and strangely beautiful meaning. When Lincoln but stood and looked down into Anne's blue eyes, her heart sang within her, and at the mere touch of her hands he caught his breath and was amazed to discover that there was so much felicity in all the world. A short time before this, Lincoln had gone into business with a drunkard, a preacher's son named Barry. The little village of New Salem was dying. All its stores were gasping for breath, but neither Lincoln nor Barry could see what was happening, so they bought the wrecks of 3 of these log cabin groceries, consolidated them, and started an establishment of their own. One day a mover, who was driving out to Iowa, halted his covered wagon in front of the Lincoln and Barry store. The roads were soft, his horses were tired, and the mover decided to lighten his load. So he sold Lincoln a barrel of household plunder. Lincoln didn't want the plunder, but he felt sorry for the horses. He paid the mover 50 cents, and without examining the barrel, rolled it into the back room of the store. A fortnight later, he emptied the contents of the barrel out on the floor, idly curious to see what he had bought. There, at the bottom of the barrel, at the bottom of the rubbish, he found a complete edition of Blackstone's Commentaries on Law. And he started to read. The farmers were busy in their fields, and customers were few and far between, so he had plenty of time. And the more he read, the more interested he became. Never before had he been so absorbed in a book. He read until he had devoured all 4 volumes. Then he made a momentous decision. He would be a lawyer. He would be the kind of man Anne Rutledge would be proud to marry. She approved his plan, and they were to be married as soon as he completed his law studies and established himself in the profession. After finishing Blackstone, he set out across the prairies for Springfield, 20 miles away, to borrow other law books from an attorney he had met in the Black Hawk War. On his way home, he carried an open book in one hand, studying as he walked. When he struck a knotty passage, he shuffled to a standstill and concentrated on it until he had mastered the sense. He kept on studying until he had conquered 20 or 30 pages, kept on until dusk fell and he could no longer see to read. The stars came out. He was hungry. He hastened his pace. He pored over his books now incessantly, having heart for little else. By day he lay on his back, reading in the shade of an elm that grew beside the store, his bare feet angling up against the trunk of the tree. By night he read in the cooper's shop, kindling a light from the waste material lying about. Frequently he read aloud to himself, now and then closing the book and writing down the sense of what he had just read, revising, rephrasing, until it became clear enough for a child to comprehend. Wherever Lincoln went now, on his rambles along the river, on his walks through the woods, on his way to labor in the fields, wherever he went, a volume of Chitty or Blackstone was under his arm. Once a farmer who had hired him to cut firewood came around the corner of the barn in the middle of the afternoon and found Lincoln sitting barefooted on top of the woodpile studying law. Mentor Graham told Lincoln that if he aspired to get ahead in politics and law, he must know grammar. "Where can I borrow one?" Lincoln asked. Graham said that John Vance, a farmer living 6 miles out in the country, had a copy of Kirkham's Grammar, and Lincoln arose immediately, put on his hat, and was off after the book. He astonished Graham with the speed with which he mastered Kirkham's rules. 30 years later, the schoolmaster said he had taught more than 5,000 students, but that Lincoln was the most studious, diligent, straightforward young man in the pursuit of knowledge and literature he had ever met. "I have known him," said Mentor Graham, "to study for hours the best way of 3 to express an idea." Having mastered Kirkham's Grammar, Lincoln devoured next Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Rollin's Ancient History, a volume on American military biography, lives of Jefferson, Clay, and Webster, and Tom Paine's Age of Reason. Dressed in blue cotton roundabout coat, stoga shoes, and pale blue cassinet pantaloons which failed to make the connection with either coat or socks, coming about 3 inches below the former and an inch or 2 above the latter, this extraordinary young man drifted about New Salem, reading, studying, dreaming, telling stories, and making a host of friends wherever he went. The late Albert Beveridge, the outstanding Lincoln scholar of his time, says in his monumental biography, quote, "Not only did his wit, kindliness, and knowledge attract the people, but his strange clothes and uncouth awkwardness advertised him, the shortness of his trousers causing particular remark and amusement. Soon the name of Abe Lincoln became a household word." End quote. Finally, the grocery firm of Lincoln and Berry failed. This was to be expected, for with Lincoln absorbed in his books and Berry half groggy with whiskey, the end was inevitable. Without $1 left to pay for his meals and lodging now, Lincoln had to do any kind of manual labor he could find. He cut brush, pitched hay, built fences, shucked corn, labored in a sawmill, and worked for a while as a blacksmith. Then, with the aid of Mentor Graham, he plunged into the intricacies of trigonometry and logarithms, prepared himself to be a surveyor, bought a horse and compass on credit, cut a grapevine to be used as a chain, and started out surveying town lots for 37.5 cents apiece. In the meantime, the Rutledge Tavern also had failed, and Lincoln's sweetheart had to go to work as a servant in a farmer's kitchen. Lincoln soon got a job plowing corn on the same farm. In the evening, he stood in the kitchen wiping the dishes which Anne washed. He was filled with a vast happiness at the very thought of being near her. Never again was he to experience such rapture and such content. Shortly before his death, he confessed to a friend that he had been happier as a barefoot farm laborer back in Illinois than he had ever been in the White House. But the ecstasy of the lovers was as short as it was intense. In August 1835, Anne fell ill. At first there was no pain, nothing but great fatigue and weariness. She tried to carry on her work as usual, but one morning she was unable to get out of bed. That day the fever came, and her brother rode over to New Salem for Dr. Allen. He pronounced it typhoid. Her body seemed to be burning, but her feet were so cold they had to be warmed with hot stones. She kept begging vainly for water. Medical science now knows that she should have been packed in ice and given all the water she could drink, but Dr. Allen didn't know that. Dreadful weeks dragged by. Finally, Anne was so exhausted that she could no longer raise even her hands from the sheets. Dr. Allen ordered absolute rest. Visitors were forbidden, and that night, when Lincoln came, even he was not permitted to see her. But the next day and the following day she kept murmuring his name and calling for him so pitifully that he was sent for. When he arrived, he went to her bedside immediately. The door was closed, and they were left alone. This was the last hour of the lovers together. The next day Anne lost consciousness and remained unconscious until her death. The weeks that followed were the most terrible period of Lincoln's life. He couldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. He repeatedly said that he didn't want to live, and he threatened to kill himself. His friends became alarmed, took his pocket knife away, and watched to keep him from throwing himself into the river. He avoided people, and when he met them, he didn't speak, didn't even seem to see them, but appeared to be staring into another world, hardly conscious of the existence of this. Day after day he walked 5 miles to the Concord Cemetery where Anne was buried. Sometimes he sat there so long that his friends grew anxious and went and brought him home. When the storms came, he wept, saying that he couldn't bear to think of the rain beating down upon her grave. Once he was found stumbling along the Sangamon, mumbling incoherent sentences. People feared he was losing his mind. So Dr. Allen was sent for. Realizing what was wrong, he said Lincoln must be given some kind of work, some activity to occupy his mind. A mile to the north of town lived one of Lincoln's closest friends, Bowling Green. He took Lincoln to his home and assumed complete charge of him. It was a quiet, secluded spot. Behind the house, oak-covered bluffs rose and rolled back to the west. In front, the flat bottomlands stretched away to the Sangamon River, framed in trees. Nancy Green kept Lincoln busy cutting wood, digging potatoes, picking apples, milking the cows, holding the yarn for her as she spun. The weeks grew into months, and the months into years, but Lincoln continued to grieve. In 1837, 2 years after Anne's death, he said to a fellow member of the state legislature, "Although I seem to others to enjoy life rapturously at times, yet when I am alone I am so depressed that I am afraid to trust myself to carry a pocket-knife." From the day of Anne's death he was a changed individual. The melancholy that then settled upon him lifted at times for short intervals, but it grew steadily worse until he became the saddest man in all Illinois. Herndon, later his law partner, said, quote, "If Lincoln ever had a happy day in 20 years, I never knew of it. Melancholy dripped from him as he walked." End quote. From this time to the end of his life, Lincoln had a fondness, almost an obsession, for poems dealing with sorrow and death. He would often sit for hours without saying a word, lost in reverie, the very picture of dejection, and then would suddenly break forth with these lines from The Last Leaf. "The mossy marbles rest on the lips that he has pressed in their bloom, and the names he loved to hear have been carved for many a year on the tomb." Shortly after Anne's death, he memorized a poem, Mortality, and beginning, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" It became his favorite. He often repeated it to himself when he thought no one else was listening, repeated it to people in the country hotels of Illinois, repeated it in public addresses. He repeated it to guests in the White House, wrote copies of it for his friends, and said, "I would give all I am worth and go in debt to be able to write like that." He loved the last two stanzas best. "Yea, hope and despondency, pleasure and pain are mingled together in sunshine and rain, and the smile and the tear and the song and the dirge still follow each other like surge upon surge. 'Tis the wink of an eye, 'tis the draught of a breath, from the blossom of health to the paleness of death, from the gilded saloon to the bier in the shroud. Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" The old Concord Cemetery where Anne Rutledge was buried is a peaceful acre in the midst of a quiet farm, surrounded on 3 sides by wheat fields and on the 4th by a bluegrass pasture where cattle feed and sheep graze. The cemetery itself is overgrown now with brush and vines and is seldom visited by man. In the springtime, the quails make their nests in it, and the silence of the place is broken only by the bleating of sheep and the call of the bobwhite. For more than half a century, the body of Anne Rutledge lay there in peace, but in 1890, a local undertaker started a new cemetery in Petersburg, 4 miles away. Petersburg already had a beautiful and commodious burying ground known as the Rose Hill Cemetery, so selling lots in the new one was slow and difficult. Consequently, the greedy undertaker, in an unholy moment, conceived the gruesome scheme of violating the grave of Lincoln's sweetheart, bringing her dust to his cemetery and using its presence there as an argument to boost sales. So, on or about the 15th of May, 1890, to quote the exact words of his shocking confession, he opened her grave. And what did he find? We know, for there is a quiet old lady still living in Petersburg who told the story to the author of this volume and made an affidavit to its veracity. She's the daughter of McGrady Rutledge, who was a first cousin of Anne Rutledge. McGrady Rutledge often worked with Lincoln in the fields, helped him as a surveyor, ate with him, and shared his bed with him, and probably knew more about Lincoln's love for Anne than any other third person has ever known. On a quiet summer evening, this old lady sat in a rocking chair on her porch and told the author, quote, "I've often heard Pa say that after Anne's death Mr. Lincoln would walk 5 miles out to Anne's grave and stay there so long that Pa would get worried and fear something would happen to him and go and bring him home. Yes, Pa was with the undertaker when Anne's grave was opened, and I have often heard him tell that the only trace they could find of Anne's body was 4 pearl buttons from her dress. So the undertaker scooped up the 4 pearl buttons and some dirt and interred them in his new Oakland cemetery at Petersburg, and then advertised that Anne Rutledge was buried there. And now, in the summer months, thousands of pilgrims motor there to dream over what purports to be her grave. I've seen them stand with bowed heads and shed tears above the 4 pearl buttons. Over those 4 pearl buttons there stands a beautiful granite monument bearing this verse from Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology. Out of me, unworthy and unknown, the vibrations of deathless music, with malice toward none and charity with charity for all, out of me the forgiveness of millions toward millions, and the beneficent face of a nation. Shining with justice and truth, I am Anne Rutledge, who sleep beneath these woods, beloved in life of Abraham Lincoln, wedded to him not through union, but through separation. Bloom forever, O Republic, from the dust of my bosom. But Anne's sacred dust remains in the old Concord Cemetery. The rapacious undertaker could not carry it away. She and her memories are still there. Where the bobwhite calls and the wild rose blows, there is the spot that Abraham Lincoln hallowed with his tears. There is the spot where he said his heart lay buried. There would Anne Rutledge wish to be. All right, that was, once again, Lincoln the Unknown by Dale Carnegie. I'm going to, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think it's kind of speaks for itself, obviously. I wanted to reiterate the good books list because, why not? I mean, it doesn't cost anything. You can go get one of these for yourself. The digital form, not the actual physical version. 500 books put together by our team at Clearwater Press. Team of avid writers and readers, and they have comments about each of the books from someone on our staff about why we think it's worth reading. Lincoln the Unknown is in there. I think almost all of the live streams that I'm doing are taken from the good books list, and I'm sharing that again tonight because we have our May book bundle where we do a giveaway of over $100 in books to someone on the list. All you have to do is download that, and you will automatically be entered to win in the sweepstakes. If you share it on social media, you'll get another ticket, and if someone else signs up, you actually get 20 tickets. So we picked the April winner already, but we haven't heard back from them, so we can't actually announce it yet because if we don't hear back after a period of time, we have to move on to someone else. So I want to show you what the May book bundle is. I want to go over some of the books. The first one is called Incident at Hawks Hill by Alan Eckert. And I read this when I was in 6th grade and really loved it. It's based on a true story about a boy who is raised by a badger. I should say that the May book bundle has a theme of into the wilderness. The next one is a Louis L'Amour book, The Lonesome Gods, which I'm actually reading right now, and I'm almost done with it. It's very interesting. Third one, Hatchet by Gary Paulson. This is a great book. I'm going to do a reading of this in a week or two. This was a Newbery Honor book, actually. Another really good book by Rosemary Sutcliffe, The Eagle of the Ninth. It's about the lost. There's actually a true story from history where a Roman legion just disappeared in the north of Britain, and no one ever, I guess, figured out what happened to them. And the eagle was the standard of the legion, and so there have been lots of stories written about what happened to them, and this is one of them. And Rosemary Sutcliffe's a really good writer. Here's a book that I have not read, but we have a really outstanding copy of it in hardcover with the original sticker on it. This is a Newbery winner called The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill, and this is on my to-be-read list. I don't know when I'll get to it. We also have something from Claire Vanderpool, who's speaking at the One Year Adventure Novel Summer Workshop this year. I'm really excited about that. Navigating Early. And again, we've got another, this is a Prins Honor book. We also have Lauren Walks Beyond the Bright Sea. And I don't know anything about this one because I have not read it, so I can't talk about it. We have, speaking of seas, we have Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, a book I've read several times and think is wonderful. This book actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's not very long. It's really more like a novella. We also have My Side of the Mountain. Many of you will have heard of this. It's a small copy. And then we have some picture books, too. We have Redwoods by Jason Chin. which has got really cool artwork in it. You can get a glimpse of it here. We have Some Birthday by Patricia Polacco. See if I can find something that will show up. Oh, here we go. I think the lighter pages will show up better in the live stream. And the last one, a hardcover picture book called Over and Under the Pond by Kate Messner, and the artwork is by Christopher Neal. So, yeah, let me see if I can pull some of the artwork out here. Well, here we go. So, large hardcover book. So you could win those. Doesn't cost anything. You just have to download the Good Books list. Hope you enjoyed Link in the Unknown, and will join me next week when I return with another book. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.